A racist manager forcefully removed a black veteran from his store, completely unaware that legendary actor Morgan Freeman was watching the entire incident unfold. What happened next? And how did Morgan Freeman, a veteran himself, respond to this blatant disrespect? The rhythmic beep of price checkers and the soft squeak of shopping cart wheels filled the air at Everyday Essentials on a calm Friday afternoon. The store's moderate foot traffic created a tranquil atmosphere, perfect for those seeking a peaceful shopping experience. Among the patrons navigating the aisles was James "Jimmy" Carter, a distinguished black veteran in his late 60s. Jimmy's presence commanded respect as he entered the store, pushing a shopping cart with a sense of purpose. His army uniform, adorned with rows of badges, told a silent story of years of dedicated service to his country. Despite the pride evident in his bearing, there was also a humility about him, a man who had seen much but sought no special treatment beyond what he had earned. As he moved through the familiar surroundings of Everyday Essentials, Jimmy's mind was focused on a singular mission: acquiring the essential items needed for his bedbound wife, Lucille. His mental checklist included adult diapers, medical supplies, and various hygiene products. Each item on his list represented not just a necessity, but a testament to the daily struggle he and Lucille faced together after their retirement. The weight of mounting medical bills pressed heavily on Jimmy's thoughts as he navigated the store. Their reliance on savings and social security made every purchase a careful consideration. Everyday Essentials had long been a lifeline for Jimmy, known for its veteran discounts that helped stretch their limited budget just a bit further. As Jimmy rounded the corner of what he thought was the hygiene aisle, he was met with an unexpected sight. Where once stood familiar shelves of products he could navigate with his eyes closed, now stood an array of completely unfamiliar items. Confusion furrowed his brow as he realized the entire store layout had been rearranged. "Why do they have to change everything?" Jimmy grumbled under his breath, frustration mounting as he struggled to navigate the store's new layout. He couldn't help but speculate. Was this the result of a management shakeup or a deliberate strategy to promote certain products? Whatever the reason, it had thrown off his typically efficient shopping routine. His thoughts drifted to Lucille waiting alone at home. Jimmy wandered through unfamiliar aisles, his once methodical approach giving way to a growing sense of disorientation. The background music, interspersed with promotional announcements about fresh produce sales, only deepened his disappointment. He wished it were hygiene or medical supplies on sale instead, items he actually needed, especially at the end of the month. As he searched for the products he needed, Jimmy's thoughts wandered to Lucille. They had been together for decades through thick and thin. She had been his rock after the war, helping him through the darkest times when the memories of combat threatened to overwhelm him. Now, it was his turn to care for her, and he could never imagine leaving her alone, not after everything they'd endured together. Jimmy's search for essential items took far longer than he had expected. By the time he finished, he found himself near the fresh produce section, drawn by the vibrant colors and the allure of healthier choices. Banners and sales tags were everywhere, beckoning customers with their tempting offers. Despite the financial constraints that always weighed on him, Jimmy couldn't help but pause, momentarily considering the possibilities. He walked around the section, contemplating the array of fruits and vegetables before him. The resounding announcement of the store's special promotion on fresh produce today made the temptation even stronger. With careful consideration, Jimmy selected a small assortment of items: a pint of strawberries, a handful of crisp apples, a bunch of leafy greens, and a small package of lean poultry. As he placed each item in his cart, Jimmy couldn't help but notice how much fresher the produce seemed compared to previous months. At least they're improving something, he thought to himself, trying to find a silver lining in the day's frustrations. However, as his cart filled with these unexpected additions, an internal struggle played across Jimmy's features. The desire to provide quality, nutritious food for Lucille warred with the harsh reality of their financial situation. Every extra dollar spent here meant potentially sacrificing something else they might need later. Jimmy stood there for a moment, one hand resting on his cart, the other rubbing his chin thoughtfully. He decided he would bring the items to the cashier anyway, curious to see how much it would all cost after applying his veteran discount and the day's promotions. Perhaps just this once, they could afford a little treat, a taste of freshness to brighten Lucille's day. With his cart now full, Jimmy made his way towards the checkout counters, unaware that his routine shopping trip was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would challenge his dignity, resilience, and faith in the very country he had served so proudly. As Jimmy approached the checkout counter, a familiar face greeted him with a warm smile. Madeline, or Maddie as she preferred to be called, was a kind-hearted cashier who had come to know Jimmy through his weekly visits. Her presence was a welcome sight, offering Jimmy his first real human connection of the day. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter," Maddie said cheerfully as Jimmy began unloading his cart. "How are you doing today? And how's Lucille?" Jimmy's face softened at the mention of his wife. "Afternoon, Maddie. I'm doing all right, thank you. Lucille's hanging in there. It's been a tough week, but she's a fighter." Maddie nodded sympathetically as she began scanning items. "She's lucky to have you, Mr. Carter. I hope these supplies help make things a bit easier for both of you." As Maddie scanned the fresh produce, Jimmy couldn't help but voice his concern. "Maddie, could you confirm today's promotion on fresh produce for me? I want to make sure I'm not overstepping our budget here." "Of course, Mr. Carter," Maddie replied, pausing to check her screen. "Yes, all fresh produce, including proteins, is 15% off today. And of course, that's in addition to your veteran discount." Jimmy nodded, relief evident in his expression. "That's good to hear. I appreciate you checking for me." As the total began to climb, Jimmy watched the screen intently. When it approached $30 for just the fresh items, he felt a twinge of anxiety. "Maddie, I may need to cancel some items depending on the final total. I hope that won't be too much trouble." Maddie glanced around, noting the empty line behind Jimmy. "No problem at all, Mr. Carter. The store's still pretty quiet this afternoon, so take all the time you need." With a grateful nod, Jimmy watched as Maddie began scanning the medication supplies, diapers, and hygiene products. As she neared the end, he prepared himself to apply his veteran discount, a small benefit he had come to rely on for these necessary items. However, as Maddie attempted to apply the discount, her brow furrowed in confusion. She tapped at her screen several times before looking up at Jimmy, discomfort evident in her expression. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Carter, but it seems there's been a policy change," Maddie said, her voice soft and apologetic. "The system won't let me apply the veteran discount to the feminine and hygiene products. It says here that this change just went into effect this morning, and unfortunately not all of us were informed. I truly apologize for the inconvenience." Jimmy blinked in surprise, his mind struggling to process this unexpected information. "I'm sorry, Maddie, but I've always been able to use the discount on these items. They're necessities for Lucille's care." Maddie nodded sympathetically. "I know, Mr. Carter, I'm really sorry about this. I wasn't aware of the change either." The sudden policy shift threatened to put the necessary supplies for Lucille out of reach. Jimmy's carefully planned budget was now in jeopardy, and he felt a mix of frustration and helplessness washing over him. "I'm afraid without the discount, I won't have enough to cover the total," Jimmy said, his voice tinged with disappointment. "I'll have to cancel all the fresh produce." Maddie began the process of removing the items, her movements slow as if hoping a solution would present itself. Jimmy stood there, his thoughts racing. This wasn't just about the money. It was about dignity, about being able to provide for his wife, about the respect he thought he had earned through his years of service. Finally, swallowing his pride, Jimmy made a decision. "Maddie, I hate to ask, but could I speak with the manager? I just want to understand why this change was made so suddenly, without any notice to regular customers, or staff like yourself. You know I'm a regular at Everyday Essentials. I even subscribe to their weekly newsletter and catalogue, so why didn't I hear anything about this?" Maddie hesitated, her body language betraying her unease even as she nodded in agreement. "Of course, Mr. Carter. I'll call for Dale Johnson right away. He is our new manager." She reached for the intercom, her voice echoing through the store as she requested the manager's presence at the checkout. As they waited, Jimmy couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that his conversation with the manager might not go as smoothly as he hoped. He took a deep breath, bracing himself for the possibility of disappointment, and began mentally preparing what he would say. The sound of purposeful footsteps approaching the checkout counter drew Jimmy's attention. He turned to see a man in his late 30s striding towards them, his dyed blue hair a stark contrast to the store's muted color scheme. This must be Dale Johnson, the manager Maddie had called. As Dale approached, Jimmy couldn't help but notice the air of arrogance that seemed to surround him. It was a stark contrast to Jimmy's own dignified but humble presence, and he felt a twinge of unease in his gut. "I'm Dale Johnson, the manager," the man announced, his tone clipped and impatient. "Is there a problem here?" Jimmy took a deep breath, reminding himself to remain calm and respectful. "Good afternoon, Mr. Johnson. I'm James Carter, a regular customer here at Everyday Essentials. I was hoping to discuss the recent change in the veteran discount policy for hygiene products." Dale's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked Jimmy up and down, his gaze lingering on the rows of badges adorning Jimmy's uniform. "What about it?" he asked, his tone dismissive. Undeterred, Jimmy pressed on. "Well, sir, I've been using the veteran discount for these essential items for years. They're vital for my wife's care, and this sudden policy change has made them financially out of reach for us. I was hoping there might be a way to reconsider this decision, if not immediately, then in the future. At the very least, providing advance notice to customers who rely on these discounts would help us plan better." Dale let out a short, harsh laugh that echoed through the quiet store. "Reconsider? Listen, old man, this isn't a farmer's market. New management, new rules, no bargaining. If you can't afford it, shop somewhere else." Jimmy felt his face grow hot, a mix of embarrassment and indignation coursing through him. He was acutely aware of the other customers who had begun to glance his way, drawn by the commotion. Still, he persisted, keeping his voice low and steady. "Mr. Johnson, I understand businesses need to make changes, but many veterans depend on these discounts for essentials like medical and hygiene supplies. We've served our country, and this small consideration goes a long way. Everyday Essentials has built its reputation on supporting veterans. We know that all around the country, and it's why we keep coming back. Changing that without warning feels like a step away from what this store stands for." Dale's demeanor shifted, his dismissive attitude morphing into something uglier. "Served your country," he sneered. "Let me tell you something, washed-up veteran. Your kind should never have been allowed to serve in the U.S. military in the first place. This country doesn't need help from people like you." "My kind?" Jimmy repeated, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Do you mean black veteran?" A hush fell over the onlookers, the sliding doors opening behind them as new customers entered, becoming unwitting witnesses to the unfolding scene. Jimmy stood there, stunned by the blatant racism and disrespect being hurled at him. Dale tried to formulate a response, his eyes fixed on the rows of service badges on Jimmy's uniform. "And what are these supposed to be?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Participation trophies. There's no way someone like you could have earned real honors." Jimmy's hand instinctively moved to touch his badges, each one a reminder of the sacrifices he and his fellow soldiers had made. "These badges represent years of service and sacrifice, Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "They're a testament to the dedication of all who serve, regardless of their race. Surely, as an American, you can appreciate the importance of honoring our veterans." Dale's face contorted with rage. "Appreciate? I'll show you what I appreciate." With a sudden movement, he shoved Jimmy hard, sending the older man stumbling backward towards the exit doors. Jimmy's military-honed reflexes kicked in, and he managed to regain his balance just as a car sped past in the loading zone. He swatted Dale's hand away from his shoulder and steadied his breath, coughing a few times, the adrenaline coursing through him. Dale stepped back, clearly rattled by the near accident, but his expression remained unchanged, his face hardening into something colder. Dale stood in the doorway, his face twisted into a smug smile. "That's what you get for trying to humiliate me in front of my customers," he spat. "Don't come back here, old man. You're not welcome anymore." As Dale turned and stormed back into the store, leaving Jimmy standing alone outside, The veteran felt a wave of emotions wash over him. Anger, humiliation, and a deep, aching sadness battled within him. The bustling parking lot faded into the background as he struggled to process the encounter with Dale Johnson. How could this happen here, in the country he had fought so hard to protect? The sun beat down on Jimmy as he leaned and steadied himself against the store's wall, trying to catch his breath and process what had just occurred. As he stood there, his breath came in short, ragged gasps. The weight of what had just transpired pressed down on him, threatening to overwhelm his usually stoic demeanor. He struggled to reconcile his years of service with the prejudice he had just faced. Memories of his time in the Gulf War flooded his mind, the camaraderie, the shared sacrifices, the unwavering belief that they were fighting for a better world. How could that world include people like Dale, who seemed to embody everything they had fought against? As his breathing slowly steadied, Jimmy's military training kicked in, urging him to assess the situation objectively. He tried to understand how someone like Dale, raised in peacetime, could harbor such hatred and disrespect. But no matter how he approached it, he couldn't reconcile the racial prejudice with his years of devoted service to the country. "Times may change," Jimmy murmured to himself, "but some battles never seem to end." The sound of a car horn jolted Jimmy back to the present. He glanced at his watch and was startled to see that he had been away from home for over 2 hours. A wave of guilt washed over him as he thought of Lucille, alone at home, probably wondering where he was. He blamed himself for getting caught up in Dale's behavior. No matter how much he dwelled on it, the man wouldn't apologize, and the store policy regarding the veteran discount wasn't going to change today. Jimmy knew he needed to prioritize Lucille's needs. Pushing himself off the wall, Jimmy reached for his phone. His fingers trembled slightly as he typed out a text to Lucille, explaining his delay. When no immediate reply came, worry began to gnaw at him. He hit the call button, listening to the ring with growing anxiety. No answer. "Come on, Lucille," he whispered, trying again. Still nothing. The lack of response added a new layer of urgency to his situation. Jimmy took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he needed to do next. He couldn't let Dale's bigotry prevent him from fulfilling his responsibilities to Lucille. With renewed determination, Jimmy straightened his uniform and walked back towards the store entrance. As the automatic doors slid open, he was hit with a wave of cool air and the realization that his original cart was nowhere to be seen. Swallowing his frustration, Jimmy grabbed a new cart and began his shopping anew. This time, he moved with quiet efficiency, selecting only the most essential items for Lucille. Each product was carefully chosen, single small units instead of bulk packages, as he mentally calculated to stay within his cash budget without the veteran discount. As he made his way through the aisles, Jimmy couldn't help but notice the longer checkout lines. The delay would only add to his growing anxiety about Lucille. Between selections, he tried calling her again, each unanswered ring increasing his worry. Finally, with a cart containing only the bare necessities, Jimmy approached the checkout. To his surprise, he found himself once again in Maddie's lane. The young cashier's eyes widened in recognition, a mix of sympathy and embarrassment crossing her features. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice low, "I'm so sorry about what happened earlier. I had no idea Mr. Johnson would react like that." Jimmy nodded, appreciating her kindness but too focused on getting home to Lucille to dwell on the earlier confrontation. "It's all right, Maddie. I agree with you, the previous manager was much kinder and respectful. I just need to get these items and head home. My wife isn't answering her phone and I'm getting worried." Maddie began scanning his items quickly, clearly trying to help him leave as soon as possible. Just as Jimmy was about to pay, a familiar and unwelcome voice boomed from behind him. "I thought I made myself clear earlier," Dale Johnson sneered, approaching the checkout with a menacing stride. "You're not welcome here. Not now, not ever again." He then turned to Maddie, his tone sharp. "And you heard me when I said we don't serve this customer anymore." Jimmy turned to face the manager, his patience wearing thin. "Mr. Johnson, I'm simply trying to purchase these essential items for my wife. I have cash, and I'll be on my way immediately after." Dale's face twisted into a cruel smile. "Oh, didn't you hear? We have a new policy. Cash transactions require a minimum purchase of $100. The arbitrary rulemaking made it clear that Dale's actions had become a personal vendetta. Jimmy looked from Dale to Maddie, who seemed just as shocked by this new policy as he was. In that moment, Jimmy realized that no amount of dignity or respect for authority could overcome the hatred that stood before him. With a heavy heart, he left the items on the conveyor belt and walked out of the store, Dale's mocking laughter following him into the parking lot. As Jimmy headed towards the bus stop, he felt a deep weariness settle into his bones. How would he explain this to Lucille? How could he have failed so completely in his simple mission to get her the supplies she needed? The afternoon sun beat down on Jimmy as he walked dejectedly toward the bus station, his mind racing with worry about Lucille and frustration over his failed shopping attempt. The weight of the day's events pressed heavily on his shoulders, making each step feel like a monumental effort. Suddenly a voice called out from behind him, cutting through his troubled thoughts. "Excuse me, sir, please wait." Jimmy turned more out of habit than interest, expecting perhaps another confrontation or misunderstanding. What he saw instead stopped him in his tracks. Running towards him, slightly out of breath but with unmistakable purpose, was none other than Morgan Freeman. The acclaimed actor carried 2 full bags of groceries, their contents clearly visible. They contained even more items than Jimmy had originally intended to purchase. As Freeman drew closer, Jimmy blinked in disbelief, wondering if the stress of the day had finally caused him to hallucinate. "Mr. Freeman?" he asked hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. Freeman, now standing before Jimmy, offered a warm smile that seemed to light up the entire parking lot. "The one and only," he replied, his distinctive voice confirming what Jimmy's eyes could scarcely believe. "My name is James Carter," Jimmy said, extending his right hand. Freeman shook it firmly, his grip solid and reassuring. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Carter." Jimmy nodded, still stunned. "But how did you... Why are you..." Freeman's expression grew serious, his demeanor shifting. "I witnessed what happened in the store, Mr. Carter. That kind of treatment is unacceptable, especially towards a fellow veteran." At the mention of his service, Jimmy's posture straightened slightly, a reflex born from years of military discipline. "You served as well, didn't you, Mr. Freeman? Air Force, if I remember correctly." A look of pleasant surprise crossed Freeman's face. "That's right. Air Force mechanic, specializing in radar systems. But please, call me Morgan." Jimmy felt a surge of emotion, a mix of pride and camaraderie. "Your service. It was an inspiration to many of us, Morgan. Seeing someone who looked like us succeed both in the military and in Hollywood, it meant more than you might know." Freeman nodded, understanding the weight of Jimmy's words. Then, with a simple gesture that carried immense significance, he extended his hand. "Thanks for your service, comrade." As they shook hands, Jimmy felt a profound shift. The humiliation of earlier began to fade, replaced by a sense of dignity and recognition. Here was a man who understood, who had walked a similar path, acknowledging the sacrifices they had both made. Gesturing to the grocery bags he carried, Freeman continued, "I hope you'll accept these. It's the least I can do to make up for the shameful way you were treated in there." Jimmy started to protest, his pride warring with his need, but Freeman held up a hand to stop him. "Please, I insist. Consider it a small token of appreciation from one veteran to another." Overwhelmed by the gesture, Jimmy could only nod in gratitude. As he accepted the bags, he noticed they were heavier than expected, filled with not just the essentials he had sought, but also fresh produce and other high-quality items. "Now," Freeman said, glancing around the parking lot, "how about we get you home? I imagine your wife must be worried by now." Before Jimmy could respond, a sleek black car pulled up beside them, driven by a professional-looking chauffeur. Freeman opened the back door, gesturing for Jimmy to enter. "My driver can take us to your place. It's the least we can do." As they settled into the plush leather seats, Jimmy gave his address to the driver. The car pulled away smoothly, leaving behind the scene of earlier humiliation and heading towards an unexpected resolution. During the ride, Freeman observed the neighborhood quietly but attentively. They passed through areas of varying economic status, the landscape changing from commercial districts to residential areas, each block telling its own story of struggle and resilience. Jimmy, still processing the surreal turn of events, found himself opening up to Freeman about his life with Lucille, their challenges, and the daily acts of love and sacrifice that defined their relationship. Freeman listened intently, his presence providing a stark and comforting contrast to Dale's earlier cruelty. As they neared Jimmy's modest home at the furthest edge of the neighborhood, a sense of anticipation filled the car. This unexpected encounter with Morgan Freeman had already transformed a day of humiliation into one of dignity and recognition. As the sleek black car came to a stop in front of Jimmy's modest home, a sense of surrealism washed over him. Here he was, a decorated veteran who had just faced blatant discrimination, now accompanied by one of the most recognizable and respected actors in the world. The contrast was almost too much to process. Morgan Freeman stepped out of the car first, his movements graceful despite his age. He immediately moved to help Jimmy with the grocery bags, waving off any protests with a gentle smile. "Please allow me," he insisted, his deep voice carrying a warmth that put Jimmy at ease. Together they walked up the short path to the front door. Jimmy fumbled with his keys for a moment, suddenly aware of the peeling paint on the doorframe and the overgrown bushes flanking the entrance. But if Freeman noticed these signs of wear and financial strain, he gave no indication. As they stepped inside, the reality of Jimmy and Lucille's living conditions became immediately apparent. The small living room was neat, but crowded with medical equipment, a hospital bed, oxygen tanks, and various mobility aids. The walls, adorned with faded family photos and Jimmy's framed military commendations, told a story of a life rich in love and service, if not in material wealth. Freeman's eyes took in the scene, his expression a mixture of respect and concern. He said nothing, but his presence seemed to fill the small space with a dignified understanding. "Lucille," Jimmy called out, his voice tinged with worry. "I'm home, sweetheart, and we have a visitor." A weak voice responded from the bedroom. "Jimmy, is everything all right? You were gone so long." Jimmy quickly made his way to the bedroom, Freeman following a respectful distance behind. As they entered, Lucille's eyes widened in disbelief at the sight of the famous actor standing in her doorway. "Mr. Freeman," she gasped, trying to sit up straighter in her bed despite her limitation. Welcome to our home." Freeman stepped forward, his smile warm and genuine. "Mrs. Carter, it's an honor to meet you. Your husband has told me a little about you on our way here. I hope you don't mind my intrusion." Lucille shook her head, still looking bewildered. "Intrusion? Not at all, but Jimmy, what happened? Why is Mr. Freeman here? What did you do?" She turned to Freeman, her voice filled with concern. "Mr. Freeman, did my husband do something wrong?" Jimmy chuckled softly and moved to Lucille's side, taking her hand in his. "It's a long story, dear," he said with a reassuring smile. "But Mr. Freeman, Morgan, he helped me out of a difficult situation at the store." As Jimmy began to recount the events at Everyday Essentials, Freeman quietly observed the couple's interaction, noting the deep bond between them despite their challenging circumstances. Lucille looked at Freeman with gratitude. "Thank you for helping my husband," she said warmly. "It means a lot to us." "You're most welcome," he said. Freeman sat down at a chair beside the bed where Lucille was resting, his expression softening as he glanced at her. Jimmy stood nearby, his hand gently placed on Lucille's shoulder. Freeman cleared his throat before speaking. "I can tell from the way you've been handling things, Jimmy, that your wife means the world to you. But I also know this kind of care isn't easy on either of you." Lucille nodded, her eyes tired but grateful. "It's been difficult," she admitted quietly. "I have multiple sclerosis. The doctors said I need complete bed rest to prevent further complications. My muscles are weak and my balance is off, which makes everyday tasks more challenging. It's not something we can just ignore, and the flare-ups can be really unpredictable." Freeman's gaze softened. "I understand MS, especially progressive MS, can be relentless. It's a disease that affects more than just the body. It impacts every part of your life. The right equipment makes a world of difference, but it can be overwhelming. Jimmy sighed, his gaze distant as he looked at his wife. It's been hard for Lucille trying to manage everything, but it's hard for me too. Some days it feels like I'm barely holding it together, especially with the cost of it all. The inflating price of medications, the supplies, the equipment, everything. Lucille gave a weak smile, her fingers tightening around Jimmy's hand. It's not just the physical strain, it's the emotional toll too. I can see the stress it's causing you, Jimmy. But I need you here helping me get through each day. When Lucille finished explaining, Jimmy offered Freeman tea or coffee, but Morgan politely declined, saying he had to leave for his next appointment. As he prepared to depart, Freeman turned to Jimmy at the door. "Thanks for your service, I'll settle the rest for you," he said before turning away. Jimmy stood there, unsure of what Freeman meant by those words, but didn't dwell on it. He closed the door behind the actor, still processing the extraordinary events of the day. Returning to the bedroom, Jimmy asked Lucille if she had read his text earlier. Lucille explained that her phone battery had died and the charger was in the living room, out of her reach. Jimmy apologized, realizing he had forgotten to return the charger to the socket next to Lucille's bed after using it in the living room the night before. Lucille glanced at Jimmy, concern etched on her face. "Do you think they'll bring back the veteran discount in the future?" she asked, her voice hopeful. Jimmy shook his head, his expression heavy with worry. "I doubt it, Lucille, and now I've got to find another store nearby that offers the discount and has what we need. I can't risk going too far with you needing me close." Lucille reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Maybe we don't need to revisit that store anymore, Jimmy. After what happened, I think we can find a better place, one that values its customers, especially veterans like you." Jimmy looked at her, her words offering a small measure of comfort. He nodded slowly, a hint of resolve in his voice. "You're right. There must be another place." Jimmy then carefully helped Lucille into her wheelchair, his movements deliberate and gentle. After assisting her with a shower and changing her diapers, he began organizing her medical supplies, his mind preoccupied with the realization that they were running dangerously low on essentials. His heart sank as he remembered he had forgotten to purchase the anti-decubitus cushion they desperately needed to prevent bedsores. Lucille noticed his distraction and softly asked, "What's wrong, Jimmy?" "My God, I forgot the cushion," Jimmy admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. "We need it. It's not something we can put off." Lucille frowned, concern flashing in her eyes. "You're not thinking of going back to that store, are you? Jimmy, someone like Dale could cause more trouble than it's worth." Jimmy knelt beside her, taking her hand in his. "Well, the cushion is not only sold at Everyday Essentials, there's another medical supply store in the same complex. I'll try to find it there, won't even need to step foot in Dale's store." "But what if he sees you?" Lucille asked, worry creasing her brow. "You know someone like him could go to great lengths to make trouble." Jimmy squeezed her hand, a calm determination settling over him. "Lucille, don't worry about me. I've faced worse situations. My military training prepared me for challenges like this. Dale's just a loud bully." Lucille sighed, her concern unwavering. "Jimmy, I trust you, but please be careful. I don't want anything to happen to you." Jimmy gave her a reassuring smile. "I promise I'll be careful, but I won't let fear stop me from taking care of you. You need that cushion, and I'll get it." After settling Lucille back in bed, Jimmy checked the bus timetable. The next one would arrive in 7 minutes, exactly the time he needed to walk from his home to the bus stop. He quickly charged Lucille's phone for her and kissed her goodbye, preparing himself for another trip to the store complex. Jimmy caught the bus, his heart heavy with apprehension. As he settled into his seat, he couldn't help but replay the earlier confrontation with Dale in his mind. The bus rumbled to life, and Jimmy found himself rehearsing potential scenarios. "If he starts trouble again," Jimmy muttered under his breath, "I won't hesitate to call the police. Enough is enough." An elderly woman sitting across from him gave him a curious look. Jimmy offered a polite nod and turned his gaze out the window, watching the familiar streets roll by. The 10-minute ride felt both interminable and all too short. as the bus finally pulled up in front of the complex housing Everyday Essentials. Taking a deep breath, Jimmy stepped off the bus. He decided to first try his luck at the separate medical supply store within the same complex. As he pushed open the door, a small bell chimed, announcing his arrival. "Good afternoon," a young clerk greeted him. "How can I help you today?" "I'm looking for an anti-decubitus cushion," Jimmy explained. "It's for my wife. She's bedridden and we need it to prevent bed sores." The clerk's face fell. "I'm so sorry, sir. We just sold our last one this morning. We're expecting a new shipment on Monday, but I'm afraid we're out of stock at the moment." Jimmy's shoulders sagged. "I see. Well, thank you anyway." As he turned to leave, the clerk called out, "You might try Everyday Essentials. I know they sometimes carry medical supplies too." Jimmy nodded, not bothering to explain his history with the store. "I'll do that. Thanks again." Stepping back out into the afternoon sun, Jimmy steeled himself for another visit to Everyday Essentials. However, as he rounded the corner, an unexpected scene greeted him. The parking lot was a hive of activity, crowded with news vans and bustling with reporters and camera crews. "What in the world?" Jimmy murmured, slowing his pace to take in the scene. As he drew closer, he caught snippets of conversation from nearby reporters. "Unprecedented move by the actor. Complete overhaul of store policies. Veteran rights at the forefront." Jimmy's confusion deepened. Then, through a break in the crowd, he spotted a familiar face. Morgan Freeman stood at the center of the commotion, his deep voice carrying over the din as he addressed the gathered media. Jimmy hesitated at the store's entrance, unsure whether to proceed or retreat. But before he could decide, Freeman's gaze swept across the crowd and landed on him. A warm smile spread across the actor's face, and he smoothly excused himself from the reporters. "Mr. Carter," Freeman greeted him warmly, clasping his hand. "I'm glad to see you here." As they spoke, Jimmy couldn't help but notice the curious glances from the gathered media. Freeman, sensing his discomfort, guided him inside the store. "Don't mind the press. They are here to highlight the need for change in how this place treats the veterans. Of course, your story will remain anonymous without your consent." Jimmy nodded, still somewhat overwhelmed by the situation. Thank you, Mr. Freeman. I never expected anything like this." Freeman's expression grew serious. "No one should face the kind of discrimination you experienced yesterday. I've made sure that won't happen again. Not here, and hopefully not anywhere else either." Inside, the store's atmosphere was noticeably different. Employees moved about with a palpable sense of new spirit in the air. "I understand you came back for a specific item?" Freeman asked. Jimmy nodded, his tone appreciative but focused. "I forgot a thing, an anti-decubitus cushion for Lucille's back." Freeman gave a knowing smile, his presence exuding quiet assurance. "I made sure everything would be smooth for you this time." It became clear that Freeman had kept his promise about settling the rest. The subtle changes, the respectful nods from staff, and the absence of any hostility spoke volumes about the actions he had taken. Before they parted, Freeman reached into his jacket and handed Jimmy a sealed letter. "I'd appreciate it if you read this later in private," Freeman said gently. Jimmy hesitated briefly, then took the letter and slipped it into his pocket. He gave Freeman a firm handshake. "Thank you for everything. You didn't just help me today. You gave me back my dignity." Freeman nodded solemnly. "You've earned that many times over, Jimmy. Take care of yourself and Lucille." With a final nod of gratitude, Jimmy turned and headed toward the medical supply section. He quickly located the anti-decubitus cushion, relieved to finally have it in hand. As he made his way to the checkout register, he noticed the fresh produce section. He paused to pick up a few apples, carrots, and gingers, Lucille's favorite combination. At the usual register, Maddie greeted Jimmy with a warm smile, clearly more at ease than during their previous encounters. "Good to see you again, Mr. Carter," she said cheerfully as she began ringing up his items. "This makes the third time I've served you today. At this rate, I might start calling you our exclusive regular." Her tone was light-hearted, and the ease of the exchange brought a small sense of relief to Jimmy as they laughed together. Maddie leaned in slightly and whispered, "By the way, the new manager called Dale in earlier. Something's happening with the management and the press outside. Feels like some big changes are on the way." Jimmy raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps they'll learn to be more humble and appreciative toward their staff and customers," he replied evenly. Maddie nodded, her smile fading slightly. "I hope so. Since the new management took over, several of us have quit. I've been pulling double shifts to cover weekdays and weekends, but honestly, it's been rough." Jimmy handed her his veteran's ID card and paid for his items. As she passed him the receipt, Maddie said, "Take care, Mr. Carter, and give my best to Lucille." Jimmy smiled back, bagging his purchases. "Thank you, Maddie, and you hang in there. Better days are coming." He left the store feeling a quiet sense of triumph, the interaction restoring a small piece of normalcy to what had been a chaotic day. Carrying a bag of groceries, Jimmy exited the store. As he walked past, he saw the press now circling Dale and the other management team members. Dale caught sight of Jimmy and gave him a regretful look, his face a mixture of shame and remorse. For a moment, Jimmy considered approaching Dale, perhaps to offer some words of wisdom or even forgiveness, but he decided against it. Some lessons were best learned in silence. Instead, he simply nodded slightly in Dale's direction and continued on his way. He headed straight for the bus stop, catching the bus just as it arrived. On the bus ride home, Jimmy held Freeman's unopened letter, its weight representing more than just paper. The familiar route felt different now, marked by the day's extraordinary events rather than its earlier humiliation. Back at home, Jimmy announced his arrival to Lucille and explained that the nearby medical supplies store was running out of stock, and thus he found the cushion back in the everyday essential, which was surrounded by press. They continued their conversation while Jimmy put the little fresh produce he bought into the fridge in the kitchen area. At the dining table, he finally opened Freeman's letter, his hands trembling slightly with anticipation. As he read, his eyes widened and he had to sit down. The message inside acknowledged a debt larger than any store discount, the government's frequent failure to properly honor veterans' sacrifices. It read, "Dear Mr. Carter, this is a little thank you for everything you've done for this country, something the government often fails to do. It's time veterans are treated with the respect and rewards they deserve. Your dignity in the face of adversity is a testament to the very values you fought to protect." The accompanying check's substantial amount, $80,000, left Jimmy momentarily speechless. He read and reread the figure, hardly daring to believe it was real. The gesture's significance went beyond its monetary value. Freeman's action represented recognition of not just Jimmy's military service, but the ongoing sacrifices he and Lucille made daily. The veteran's gratitude mingled with renewed pride in his service. In the kitchen, Jimmy decided to make something special to mark the occasion. He pulled out the juicer they rarely used due to the mess and expense, and began to make an apple, carrot, and ginger juice for Lucille and himself. The whirring sound of the juicer echoed through the house, a cheerful noise that seemed to signal the change in their fortunes. When Jimmy appeared at the bedroom door, Lucille looked up from her book, curiosity etched on her face. "Jimmy, what's all that noise? Is everything all right?" Jimmy smiled, holding up 2 glasses of vibrant orange juice. "Everything's more than all right, sweetheart. I've made us a little treat." Lucille's eyes lit up at the sight of the fresh juice. "Oh, Jimmy, you didn't have to go to all that trouble." "It's no trouble at all," Jimmy said, approaching her bedside. He helped her sit up, arranging the pillows behind her back for support. "Here, try some." As Lucille sipped the juice through a straw, her eyes closed in appreciation. "It's delicious, Jimmy, but what's the occasion?" Jimmy sat on the edge of the bed, pulling out the envelope. "Well, that's what I wanted to talk to you about." Jimmy began to recount the details from his return to the store to the media frenzy and Freeman's intervention. As he spoke, Lucille listened intently, her expression a mixture of disbelief and joy. "And then," Jimmy said, his voice thick with emotion, "he gave me this." He handed Lucille the letter and check. Lucille read the letter aloud, her voice growing shakier with each word. When she got to the amount on the check, she had to stop, tears welling up in her eyes. $80,000, she whispered, looking up at Jimmy. And all our medical expenses and supplies to be covered by a foundation for veterans' families? Jimmy, is this real? Jimmy nodded, taking her hand in his. It's real, sweetheart, all of it. For a moment they sat in stunned silence, the magnitude of this gift slowly sinking in. Then, almost in unison, they began to laugh, a joyous, relieved sound that filled their small home with hope and possibility. As their laughter subsided, Jimmy leaned in to kiss Lucille gently. Things are going to be easier now, love. We can get you that new wheelchair, maybe even look into some home improvements. Lucille squeezed his hand, her eyes shining. Oh, Jimmy, it's like a weight has been lifted, isn't it? Jimmy nodded, feeling tears prick at his own eyes. It sure is, and you know what? It's not just about the money. It's about being seen, being valued, after all these years. You deserve it, Jimmy, Lucille said firmly. You've given so much to this country and to me. It's about time someone recognized that. As they sat together, sipping their juice and discussing plans for the future, Jimmy felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. The day that had begun with humiliation had ended with renewed hope and dignity. Outside, the world continued to turn. At Everyday Essentials, policies were being rewritten, staff were being retrained, and a new era of respect for veterans was dawning. In newsrooms across the country, the story of an unnamed veteran's encounter with discrimination and the celebrity intervention that followed was being prepared for broadcast, promising to spark conversations about how America treats its heroes. But here, in this modest home filled with love and newfound hope, Jimmy and Lucille Carter simply held hands and smiled, grateful for each other and for the unexpected twists of fate that had brought them to this moment of peace and possibility. As the afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the room, Jimmy realized that sometimes the greatest battles we face are not fought on foreign soil, but in our own communities. And sometimes the most powerful weapons we have are not guns or tanks, but kindness, dignity, and the courage to stand up for what's right. With Lucille's hand in his and a future suddenly bright with promise stretching out before them, Jimmy Carter, veteran, husband, and unexpected catalyst for change, felt truly at peace for the first time in years. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger and more hopeful than ever before.